Now we do understand. Some of us are not so good at math, and you did well. But I think the bigger question, though, and I'll throw this starting with Ellie, why hasn't the math added up? We understand this or that, but why, for example, couldn't the ultra-Orthodox party sit with Benny Gantz? Or some of Benny Gantz's partners from the left sit with Netanyahu? Why isn't the math adding up?
Well, first of all, not pregnant, just lots of burekas. So just to clear this thing up. But the thing is that for many years now, throughout the Netanyahu years at least, the political landscape appeared very clear, as if we have the center-left, which are those center-left parties, and the right-wing parties, including the ultra-Orthodox parties. But if we're being honest, the ultra-Orthodox parties were never aligned with either side of the political map, right? The ultra-Orthodox parties have a very clear agenda when it comes to religion and state, but they do not align themselves when you're talking about your go-to left-right politics. But during the Netanyahu years, Netanyahu managed, as a very savvy politician, to maintain this perception as if the ultra-Orthodox parties, this is the Sephardi Shas party and the Ashkenazi Torah Judaism party, as if they are part of the right-wing political landscape. But it was not always that simple. And I think that if we are heading through a political breakthrough, it will be the ability of center left-wing parties or centrist parties to break this alliance of the ultra-Orthodox parties with the right wing, with Benjamin Netanyahu, and create a different format of a government. That could be a potential political breakthrough, because according to all recent polls, including the most recent i24NEWS poll in conjunction with the Israel Hayom Daily poll, there's still the deadlock between the right wing and the left wing, but this is all due to the commitment or the faithfulness of the ultra-Orthodox parties with the so-called right-wing bloc.
I do want to say, again, if anybody would like to ask a question at any time, starting from now, or even just make a statement, feel free to do it. Don't be shy. I just ask that you keep it brief. Owen wears another hat besides being a reporter. You don't know, he has a law degree. He was once a lawyer. And I think that's important, Owen, because I think a lot of people still don't understand why it is a problem for the blue and white party to sit. They said they'll sit with the Likud, but not with Benjamin Netanyahu. Why? What is the problem there? And something has changed. This is not the same as its last two. There's a big change. Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted. Before the charges just with him, he has now been actually indicted with 3 charges of corruption. We don't have to go into that. Could that play a role in this election, even after the election?
Well, Calev, you're right. Once upon a time, I was a lawyer. I still have that degree, still pay my $350 or whatever it is every 2 years to the New York bar so that I can still pretend to be a lawyer. But at the end of the day, this is probably...
Your joke more than my Burekas joke, really?
We're all...
Lawyers are always fun.
Yeah, we can always make fun of ourselves. It's sort of an unfair advantage.
Fair enough.
But at the end of the day, this is probably not a legal question and probably more a political question. Why do I say probably? Because there is, I think, probably an outside chance that the Supreme Court, after the election, decides that even though Benjamin Netanyahu is allowed under Israeli law to continue serving as prime minister, even though he is under indictment, that they could decide after the election that while Netanyahu can continue serving as prime minister, even though he's under indictment, he cannot form a new government. In American terms, he cannot start a new term. Now, I say that there is a petition in front of the court, and they decided to wait on that petition until after the elections. I think they're probably not going to accept it. I think they probably don't want to get involved in the politics, but they've kicked that can down the road. Assuming the Supreme Court does not get involved, this is really a political question, and what Gantz is saying to the Israeli public is, you should not want Benjamin Netanyahu to be serving as prime minister, even though he's under indictment. And the way to make that happen is by voting for me. And for Benny Gantz and for his blue and white party, This for them is the central issue of the election campaign. They've branched off into other issues over the last few days, but this is really the core part of their message. You got to remember the Blue and White Party, we call it a party, but it's really a coalition of different groups. And the one thing that really holds these different groups together is this issue of Netanyahu not serving, particularly not serving while he's under indictment. Now, what does the Israeli public think about this? Look, we've had the results from the first election when, it's true, he wasn't indicted, but the legal investigations were well known. And the same as during the second election. And in terms of the recent polls, including our channel's most recent poll. And again, the public is divided on this. But Netanyahu's voters, by and large, have stuck with him. And those who are upset about the investigations and don't think that someone who is indicted should serve as prime minister, those who think that this is disqualifying, they've already been with other parties and been on blue and white side of the political map. So it's hard to see how this really changes all that much politically.
Okay, I see some hands raised. Let's start with some of the questions. Can I ask you just introduce yourself as little or as much as you want before you ask the question?
Hi, my name is Rachel. I had a question just about where I should be aligning my vote. So in the first election in April, it was my first time voting in Israel, and I asked some people for advice, and I was advised to vote more on a strategic vote as opposed to with the political party I felt more aligned with. I'm wondering, going forward, how you would feel how I should vote.
I'm going to throw that to Ellie. It's a great question. And by the way, look at how much that parallels what's happening, for example, in the U.S. with the Democratic Party. People are saying, well, I like this, or Bernie Sanders, but Joe Biden, or he used to be, somebody else is more electable. So that's the question you're asking. I like this party, but maybe I should vote another one to get my block. Ellie, why don't you take that?
So I've been mocked in the past for coining that phrase, but inner block cannibalism, this is how it is being dubbed here in Israel. This is when you see the bigger parties trying to take a chunk out of the smaller parties of their respective blocks, whether it's the right side of the political map or the left. And the entire, the name of the game in Israeli politics is obviously building a coalition. So it's not enough to vote for your favorite party, but rather to think overall strategically, as you said, and vote for the party who has the highest prospects of forming a coalition. With that said, we've seen opposite trends to an extent in the past two election campaigns. In the ahead of the April election campaign, we've seen many so-called vanity lists, based on a certain personality that should be enough to persuade voters to vote for them. In the September elections, we've seen the opposite trends. We've seen mergers rather than separation. We've seen less parties. And I think that now we're seeing even less. If we're taking a look at the left side of the political map, we're seeing this merger of the Labor, Gesher, Meretz, that 2 election campaigns ago would have been completely different ideologies, but now are running under the same ticket. And similarly so on the right side of the political map. The Yamina list is combining ideologies that many would suggest to be substantially different. So I think that the entire political landscape here in Israel is taking somewhat of a different shape, realizing that the system of this huge amount of many different parties is simply counterproductive to an extent. Firstly, because you have the great potential of alleged political extortion, because if you would potentially have a party with 4 seats out of 120, and they would vehemently demand the defense ministry, right? But they represent only 4% out of 120, right? So it's very disproportional. So I think there is a realization that even if the political system here in Israel will not change, there should be a shift in the perception of how political forces should be aligned. And we're seeing it again, both on the right side with the Yamina list, which is again a combination of multiple different lists, and on the left side of the political map. So I think that the the strategic voting, to an extent, is somewhat being challenged. I wish I could guarantee that there will not be as a first round of election, but I think there is a very profound realization that ideology must play a role in establishing lists or parties, and it could not be just a PR thing, right? It should truly represent the will of the voters and not just play a political role in this jigsaw puzzle of forming a coalition. So I think that your question is a very sincere concern of every Israeli in terms of what are we? Like, what are the elements that are establishing this state of Israel and the political landscape of Israel? I wish I could have had a very clear-cut answer, but I think that the politicians themselves are still figuring it out. And I think that the trend of mergers and unions rather than vanity lists, again, so-called vanity lists to an extent, is vanishing. And I truly believe it is a good thing, at least for the time being.
Very quick thought. I personally am not a believer in strategic voting. I think people should go out and vote for what they believe, for the party that best fits their worldview. That's what I've always done in my own votes. That said, listen, that's not the way the public's voting. A lot of people here are using strategic voting. When I remember going out the day before, I think it was the first round, but who can possibly remember, of these elections and talking to people on the streets of Tel Aviv, and the vast majority of people, in explaining who they were voting for and why, were talking about strategic voting. So it's something that is happening on the ground. And if you look at the messages that the campaigns are sending out, again, these messages at least should be based on polling and based on research and based on strategic thought. Those messages are very often about strategic voting. So it's something that's happening on the ground. I personally don't believe in it, but that's part of our politics.
Just on a practical note, to put it as practically as possible, if 2 elections ago your main issue was, the most important issue for you was being able to smoke a joint out on Rothschild, that option, and have a realistic chance to see the party making that the issue, Moshe Feiglin get in the Knesset, you're not going to have that option in this election. In this election, the parties have merged, and it's really becoming the big issues, especially the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the religious issues. Yes, the lady there with the microphone.
Hi, I'm Diana, and I'm a board member of what's referred to in the press as the liberal pro-Israel PAC in America, J Street. And my question is, has your polling indicated that there's been any impact on the election from the release of the so-called peace plan?
Well, I'm going to ask which of you want to take that. Owen?
Yeah, I mean, listen, I think the short answer is no, but when you take a deeper dive, there are some very, very interesting findings from our latest poll about these issues. For example, you ask the Israeli public, do you think, and I'm trying to get the the question precise because it was precisely worded, does Israel need to accept the Trump peace plan in its entirety? And there's 39% of the public that says yes, 31% that says no. But then you ask yourself, who are those 31%? Because as you well know, this is a plan that among the Israeli public has faced opposition from the left, as you well know, but also from the right. Lots of people on the right don't like the fact that this plan calls for a Palestinian state. And like certain elements of the plan, maybe even like most of the plan, like the spirit of the plan. But in terms of accepting the plan in its entirety, and I'm sure that's the reason why this was phrased the way it was, a lot of those people would be expected to answer no. But if you look at who those 31% are, the bottom line is the vast majority are either Arab voters or leftists. On the Yamina list, for example, 50% support accepting the plan in its entirety, and far fewer oppose it, and that's true in the Likud as well. So Netanyahu, what we can say, I think, with confidence, at least based on this poll, is if Netanyahu has tried to sell this plan to his base and to right-wing voters as a historic opportunity, By and large, they've agreed. We should say the exception being those voters for Otzma Yehudit, for the Jewish Power Party. They come out against the plan. And that's clear in our polling, although I'm sure it's a very small sample size of those voters. But Netanyahu does seem to have succeeded in convincing his base that this is an important opportunity.
Well, I will have to disagree at this point. I've been escorting Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in his most recent trip to Washington, the great unveiling of the Trump peace plan, and the first briefing we've had with him in the aftermath of the great unveiling. I have to be honest, on the very basic human level, was filled with excitement. He truly thought he had finally delivered the golden opportunity for his right-wing electoral base, right? He thought that he was finally given the green light to promote this notion of applying Israeli sovereignty over those disputed territories in the West Bank, the northern part of the Dead Sea, and the Jordan Valley. But as we've heard more Trump administration officials, most notably, of course, Jared Kushner, talking about this this issue, we've realized that there are at least some degree of disagreement or miscommunication from the Israeli standpoint when we're talking about how rapid could the implementation of this annexation could really take place. I think that when we're talking about the potential prospects of the two-state solution, it's actually not about the right wing so much, rather about the center-left, right? Because if you're looking at the Blue and White Party, which we all need to bear in mind, consists of three different political parties, right? The centrist Yesh Atid party of Yair Lapid that was born a few years ago, back in the days when we cared about economics, right? Feels like ancient history, but it was only back in 2011 when there was those big protests right here on Rothschild Boulevard of youngsters marching out and saying we need to make a living, we need to have a fair chance to live our lives, right? It's just a non-topic when we're talking about 2020 March elections. The second element is Israel resilience of Benny Gantz, a former IDF chief of staff, extremely respectable. Many thought that he could be a game changer, but obviously in the past two rounds of election, he was not a game changer. He could have been a right fit to potentially become a prime minister, but did not really break the long-standing deadlock between right and left here in Israel. And the somewhat right-wing, or rather hawkish, party of Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, who served as a defense minister under Benjamin Netanyahu in multiple governments. So they all combined together with one very clear agenda, just not Netanyahu, right? So it's not about economics, it's not about a different perspective vis-a-vis the Gaza Strip and how Hamas should be treated, ruling, of course, the Gaza Strip, whether Qatari money should be flowing in or not. It's not about a different perspective vis-a-vis the Palestinian Authority in the West Bank, right? It's more or less the same agenda, just simply not Benjamin Netanyahu. And clearly enough, in the past two elections, it was not enough to win over Israelis, right? And I think that when we're talking about peace, especially in the aftermath of the great unveiling of the Trump peace plan, if we're talking about fundamental or rather substance differences between right and left here in Israel, it seems to be more or less a consensus. One state, two states, remember this Trump announcement when he first assumed office? No longer relevant, obviously, two states. In what form, how many % of the territory, that could be debated. No one's doubting that. But the Blue and White Party should have been the main challenge of the Netanyahu ideology, remains in the third round of election still just not Netanyahu. And that appears to be not enough to win over Israelis.
2 sentences just to complete the answer to your question. First, Ellie raised a very important point. When you look at our polling, and again, this was taken a few days before the latest American announcements, obviously, as you would expect, strong support in those right-wing parties for annexation before the election, so those expectations might be disappointed. Also, it was 35% of the Israeli public, not 39%, that supported the plan. Still a plurality.
Okay. Yes, another question, the lady in red there.
It's okay. Hi, my name is Lydia, and I'm American. And I guess this is a continuation of the very good things that you were just saying there. It was very informative, and it kind of piggybacks off of her question. So earlier you were talking about how it's anyone but Netanyahu, right? So what makes Benny Gantz not electable or more electable? Like, is it a specific policy he's supported in the past, or is it just that he's, like you said, not different enough?
No, I do want to clarify. I think because this party came from nowhere to becoming the biggest party in Israel. But I think Ellie's point was it didn't fundamentally change the political map. In other words, instead of the Labor Party, which traditionally would be the #1 party, Blue and White just took that position of the Labor Party, which was in decline.
Another thing I wanted to say as well is that you mentioned Lieberman doesn't like how he cooperates with the Arabs, right? And is it just the fact that he's cooperating alone that's enough to make people say no, thank you, or is there a specific policy that he's supporting that people don't like?
Well, you know what? This is a big story that is in the news this week and has to be looked at, the role of the Israeli Arabs. And there are maybe people here that who are fairly new to the country, don't even know the traditional point of view. There's a lot of history, and the issue of the Israeli Arab parties not being a part of government has come aboard. So I'm just going to throw it to one of you to deal with why. I mean, you just threw it there as a fact, Owen. You said the right of course, doesn't want the Israeli Arab parties, but also Benny Gantz in this election chose not to sit with them. So why is that? Why are the Israeli parties, as of now, disqualified from basically serving in any government?
This is perhaps the successful element of Netanyahu's political tactics, right? Because if you look at the demographics, right, the Arab population in Israel is 25%. They could have potentially have 24 out of 120 parliamentary seats. But Netanyahu and the right-wing campaign has been so successful that even the center-left is trying not to get too close with the potential support of the joint Arab list, which is, according to all recent polls, including our own, the i24NEWS most recent poll in conjunction with the Israeli Daily Israeli, gives them between 30 to 14 seats. They could be a real political game changers. But even when we're talking about that, the potential support of the joint Arab list is only external, meaning that they will vote in favor of a potential Gantz-led, blue and white-led coalition, will not be a member of it, right? So they will not be a member of an Israeli government. They will support it from the outside. It might be enough when we're talking about the count of votes, right? But not members of this government. But I think the most significant element of that is that in the public discourse, the Israeli public discourse, this is somewhat perceived as illegitimate to an extent.
I just want to add, yes, just a bit of history. There's been one government in the history of Israel which didn't take in the Israeli Arab parties but relied on them for external support. That was the 1992 government of Yitzhak Rabin that passed the Oslo Agreement. Right. And there hasn't been since then. So this is still a tricky issue, and I'm not going to go into, there was a whole issue of an Israeli Arab parliament member who was disqualified and then put back in, but you can read about it in the papers. Yes, this gentleman over here.
Hi, my name is Alec. I'm also a lawyer paying my dues to Missouri Bar to continue.
We won't hold it against you.
My question relates to Bibi and his indictment. How long will it take for the proceedings to play out? What's the likelihood of a conviction? And can you briefly touch on the issue of immunity?
All right, well, I'm going to defer to our lawyer. Those are all good questions, and they're all going to play a role, because the big question people ask, is he going to be sitting in a courtroom while he's running for office or trying to govern the country?
You're really getting me in trouble with this whole lawyer thing. One real quick thing on the issue of Israeli Arabs, also going to our poll. Very controversial for the blue and white leadership, again, 3 former heads, top dogs of the Israeli military, to go into any kind of partnership with some members of that joint list who call Israeli soldiers war criminals. On the other hand, our poll asked all Israeli voters, but including them, blue and white supporters, what they think about that kind of government. 59% of blue and white voters would support that minority government with outside Arab support. Only 19% opposed. So very, very interesting to see just how strong the support is among blue and white's base. As for the indictment, I spoke with the criminal lawyer the day the indictment was filed. Bottom line, and a surprise to no one, it's going to take a long time. Before the elections, what could happen is the panel of judges at the Jerusalem District Court that's going to hear the case, 3 judges, could be appointed, and Netanyahu could make hay about the judges being leftist or biased or try to bring, maybe there's real claims for this or I don't know. And that might happen before Election Day, but that's just about it. It's going to take a long time. His lawyers have not actually seen all of the evidence yet for various reasons, and obviously they will have the right to see it and to examine it before the trial really gets started. And it's a matter of months, not years, until the trial starts, but it will take a long time. There are a lot of witnesses. In terms of the chances of a conviction, I defer to the best legal minds or Israeli-trained lawyers on that, but you would hope that there is a strong likelihood of conviction for anyone who's indicted, that we're not running around indicting people who don't get convicted. But of course, Netanyahu, as all defendants do, have the chance to make his case in court. There's a complicated file. Everybody says that. There are a lot of witnesses. And Netanyahu, I'm sure, will have the top legal talent on the case. So we'll see. But it will take years. What would it mean for him as prime minister? All experts say it takes a considerable amount of time for a criminal defendant in terms of the time they have to spend with the lawyers going over the case and even time physically in court. One thing that's been reported into the media is that Netanyahu may have to schedule his famous trips abroad that have been such a hallmark of his time in office around the schedule of the trial, that the trial will not schedule on his trips, but it'll be vice versa, so that would be a big change. In terms of how much this actually would interfere with his running the government, it's a political question for the public to decide. On the one hand, it's a lot of time, a big time commitment. On the other hand, Netanyahu is famous for being known for being able to jungle many, many different topics and many different types of pressure successfully, as he's done throughout the time in office, even his supporters and his detractors both say.
If I may add, neither or either or, when we're talking about Netanyahu's legal cases or Netanyahu's statesmanship skills, history shows that as long as the discourse revolves around Netanyahu, whether he's fit to be prime minister, yes or no, whether he is a great statesman, yes or no, he still manages to make the benefit out of it, right? As long as the focus of the discourse is around Netanyahu, even if it's not clear-cut, as in being able to form a self-sufficient right-wing government, he still manages to benefit out of it. And more so, if we're talking about campaign strategies, one very profound realization the Netanyahu campaign had from the past 2 campaign elections was that Netanyahu needs to be more out and about, right? That his impact on people, like this very direct connection with the people, the mere presence of Netanyahu has an impact. And this is why we're seeing more of Netanyahu in rally campaigns around the country. This is why we're likely to see much more of him until Election Day. It's less Facebook, more just actually going out and meeting people. This is what the Netanyahu team, at least, believes will be the political game changer. These are the potential, again, according to the Netanyahu team, the potential 4 seats that will make a difference between not being able to form a coalition and reaching this golden number of 61 seats.
Trying to think if there's anybody in American politics right now who's like that. Could be. Yes.
Hi, my name is India. I'm a new intern at I24, and
welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm American. So given that, we have the concept of innocent till proven guilty. So, in regards to Netanyahu's indictment, are the Israelis seeing it as such, or is that why there's such a huge divide?
Okay, again, maybe Owen, but I will say, it's just to clarify again, under Israeli law, a prime minister who is indicted gets that benefit of the doubt. He does not have to resign. Anybody below the prime minister has to resign. So in a way, it's similar to, that is, even though it's a prime minister and not a president, it's sort of a parallel, you might say, with what happened with President Trump, which is that even the argument, and you heard it from Alan Dershowitz especially, even if the president may have committed a crime, if that crime doesn't rise to what the Constitution calls high crimes and misdemeanors, then he can't be removed from office. So there are some slight similarity. I'm talking about what Alan Dershowitz said.
Something worse, if the president does it and he means well.
He did say something worse, but I'm not going that far. But I'm going to ask, but here's a question. I think that a question also, innocent but proven guilty, that's what his followers would say. So maybe one of you take this thing is, why would people who, even if Benjamin Netanyahu has been indicted, he has been indicted, what is the thinking there that they still believe that he must be the man who leads the country?
Well, first of all, in terms of the legal status, what Calev said is correct. A prime minister under Israeli law can continue to serve as prime minister even though he's under indictment. But the lingering question is, and I mentioned this before, can a prime minister, in American terms, start a new term? Can someone form a government while he's under indictment? There's a petition before the Israeli Supreme Court on this. I was there for the hearing a few months ago. They kicked the can down the road to decide it after the elections. I think they're not going to get involved. I think they would let Netanyahu form the government, but there's still that outside chance that they won't. So that's the legal situation. In terms of the political situation, you know, there was a major protest in Tel Aviv a few months ago at the time when the decision to indict was announced by the Attorney General. And a lot of the most fervent supporters of Netanyahu and the Likud party came out. An event that got a lot of news coverage. There were a lot of reporters, not our team, thankfully, that were taunted and even worse by some of the people there. And when you're there and you talk to the people, you see just how this issue of Netanyahu's legal situation is connected to a much deeper issue in Israeli society. As many of you know, and the years after the formation of the State of Israel, 700,000 some Jews came here from Arab countries. And it's very, very hard to absorb that many people in this fledgling country. And there was some discrimination. And there is a lingering sense among the descendants of those 700,000, and those, of course, who are still with us, of ongoing discrimination by Israel's elite, by the Ashkenazi elite, by the left-wing elite against them. And they see themselves in Netanyahu's legal problem. They see their own families' stories of being sidelined by the establishment, of being treated badly by the elite, of being treated badly by the political left, as being of a piece with what Netanyahu is going through. And Netanyahu has connected to his base in that way, explicitly sometimes, and sometimes less explicitly. But he has made this a story not just about him, but about them, and you hear it over and over again. And when he talks about how the police are against him, how the judges are against him, how the law enforcement system is against him, he is telling, he feels their story too, and many people among that demographic feel that he's telling their story. I don't want to generalize. Obviously, there's huge differences of opinion and there's lots of nuance. But there's certainly a segment of the Israeli public that sees themselves in Netanyahu's story. And that's why they trust him and believe him and are on his side, because they feel that he's fighting their fight and they're fighting his fight. And there is, in some sense, a parallel to Donald Trump and his strategy in the United States in this sense. So I think that that's the deeper story of what's going on. But we should say, and this is an interesting feature, an unexpected feature of this third election campaign, we expected Netanyahu's strategy on February 10th to be that strategy from late November, attacking law enforcement authorities, telling this story of discrimination through his case. But he's decided to change strategies. He wants to talk about the Trump peace plan. He wants to talk about annexation, whether now or after the elections. He wants to talk about his trips and the diplomatic success stories. He wants to tell a different story, and he's had a different strategy. And I think the upshot is it's been a much more positive election campaign, and in some senses less divisive. We'll see if it works well for him or well for his opponents. Of course, that's still to be determined. And I'm not saying that the old campaign has fully disappeared, but I do think that we're seeing a more positive campaign on behalf of the Likud than I think we would have expected 2 months ago.
But to clarify that change in strategy, even though Benny Gantz has not won the last 2 elections, neither has Benjamin Netanyahu. He's been unable to form a government. It looks like he's decided he's got as much votes as he could get with that narrative of being persecuted, and now he has to reach beyond it. And again, I don't want to assume how many people know so much about Israeli politics. Owen gave you some of the historical context. Benjamin Netanyahu, of course, is not a Jew of Middle Eastern origin, a Mizrahi Jew. He's playing on that sentiment. We do have a minister in the government, the interim or acting interior minister, Aryeh Deri, of the Shas party, who was charged with corruption charges, indicted, was sent to prison, served, I think, 7 years in prison, came out of prison, had to wait another, I think, 7 years before he was allowed to go back. He went back into politics, and he went back in, and his public votes for him. And again, they do see that historical discrimination, the deep state, you could call it in a sense. They feel it's been unfair, and that's what they're responding to. Yes, there was someone over here with the microphone.
Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the Arab parties, if you could just speak a little bit more about that. So one question I have is, so I know that voting has actually been controversial for some Arab communities in Israel. So how is it different going into the third election? Have people felt galvanized by the results that they've seen from the other elections, or there's still kind of a split? And what do you see happening? Like, you've spoken about the power that they have as a voting bloc. Do you see any possibility for any change moving forward?
Before I do that, I wanted to do an experiment. Let me just say that this crowd is probably the most unrepresentative crowd of Israeli society as you could gather. But I would like to ask a question. I'm not asking you whether, and you could choose to participate or not. I'm not asking you whether you're going to vote for the Arab parties, but I would like to just sort of take a poll of those, say, who believes it would be legitimate and they would support a government with the Israeli Arab parties in it? And are there any people who feel, because of their actions, that they would not support a government with the Israeli Arab parties? Okay, so this is not a representative crowd, clearly.
No, but you know what? Before that even, when we're talking about the blue and white party, for an example, right? We're talking about hawkish elements such as Moshe Bogi Ya'alon, Yoaz Hendel, those are like very inside baseball when we talk about Israeli politics, Zvi Hauser, and leftist elements such as Yael Gilman, etc. But the Joint Arab List, we're taking it as if it's a one-size-fits-all policy. But they are so profoundly, they disagree on so many issues. You have communist elements, like full-on communist elements within this Joint Arab List. You have liberal elements. We consider it as a one Joint Arab List, but when we're talking about ideology, there are very much, there are substantial differences in that extent, and we should not take it for granted the fact that they managed to merge back together, because not so many election campaigns ago they ran separately. It was obviously counterproductive for them, so they decided to merge back together. But the ideological differences between the different elements that consist of this Joint Arab List are very much fundamental, and in this respect, they have to present this somewhat united front, which is very much not united, right? Because they disagree on so many different issues. But their initial point is not to join any potential Israeli government, obviously. But the main game changer here, perhaps, is voter turnout, right? Is how are they able to encourage as much Israeli Arabs to actually head out and vote. Israeli Arabs are very much disencouraged to engage in the Israeli political system. They feel that no matter what they do, it does not work in their benefit, right? They do not have their voice. They cannot really convey their concerns. Many of them feel that those political entities do not represent their daily needs, right? You have high crime percentages in Arab communities. They have education concerns. They have welfare concerns, and they feel that the Arab parties are focusing perhaps too much on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So many of them feel, you know what? We just don't care about the political system, so we shouldn't head out and vote. So this is a very substantial dilemma the Arab politicians has, whether they should really engage in the daily political concerns of their electoral bases or focus on the outmost political goal, which is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. But the Arab voter turnout has a crucial political role when Arabs go out and vote. And we, of course, all remember this infamous quote of Benjamin Netanyahu, the Arabs are going out in droves and buses blah, 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 to the ballot boxes. They have an impact on the overall political landscape. And this is why Netanyahu and his campaign are putting so much emphasis on encouraging right-wing electoral bases to head out in droves to the ballot boxes, because this balance is important in the overall political landscape. And if you do have 14 seats to a potential joint Arab list, it has an impact on the overall prospects of either side to form a self-sufficient coalition.
Owen, what about our own polling? What has it been showing?
Yeah, well, a couple things. First of all, in terms of turnout, the question that Ellie was eloquently discussing, look, we asked people how likely you are to turn out, and supporters of the joint list, and we should be precise, that is not the same as the Arab-Israeli public. Many of them vote for parties other than the joint list, and there are some Jews who vote for the joint list. But anyway, voters for the joint list, their potential turnout numbers are not great, but not catastrophic. There are some parties with worse numbers, Israel Beitenu, for example, interestingly enough. But their numbers are not great. In terms of we also asked, again, going back to that question we talked about before, would you support this idea of a minority government with the joint list supporting from the outside? And it's not to be taken for granted that supporters of the joint list and Israeli Arabs would support that. There's opposition within the sector traditionally to cooperating with Zionist parties, but our poll, as have many, many polls over the last few months, so the overwhelming majority do support it. 51% would support that kind of government, only 23% against. So that's interesting too. Finally, another interesting nugget from this poll, of those who voted for the Democratic Union in the September elections, what's now essentially the Meretz party, and as Calev said, right, the left-wing party, 24% of those who voted for that party in September are going to be voting for the joint list, according to what they told us, which is very, very interesting. There are reasons for that. The merger with the Labor Party might have driven some away. We also don't know if those 24% are Jews who are going to be voting for the joint list or Arabs who went to Meretz are going back. But anyway, an interesting statistic, and if that's true, would count for one entire seat in Parliament, which sounds small but could be very important in these elections.
And as you said, 51% would support. That was slightly lower than the number in this room, just confirming my view. This is the least representative body in terms of the Israeli public. We have time for one more, the young lady in the back.
Hi. I want to take it back to the Trump peace deal and ask a question. So one analysis that I heard is that Trump basically ensured that there's not going to be a fourth round of election by calling Benny Gantz and Bibi separately, sitting down with them both and telling them, here's the peace plan, agree to it, and then get yourself together and get a unity government in place. So do you agree with that? Do you think we're finally going to see a unity government with the help of Trump or not?
Right. I want to just put a fine point. What people have been saying is that Donald Trump's goal is to make the deal of the century, not to help Benjamin Netanyahu. He wants that trophy before the November election. So his plan was not to help Prime Minister Netanyahu as much as he may like him, but in fact to create the circumstances for a national unity government that would accept it, and both those parties have accepted it, and that way, creating that, he would create a government that would accept this plan and that would help him domestically. That is a theory. Ellie, you were in Washington with the Prime Minister. You were there at the White House. Does that sound plausible to you?
If you think I have a clearer answer than all the rest. I fully agree with Calev that the prime goal of President Trump is to reach this deal of a century. But if we're looking at the political campaigns of both Netanyahu and Gantz, they're so one against of the other. There's just simply no ground to create a unity government, right? And if I'm looking at the way the Israeli media covered this truly significant diplomatic event, right? An American administration presenting a potential peace plan to create peace in the Middle East, right? Which we should all get so excited about it. Israeli media covered it as if it's a potential summit between Benny Gantz, Benjamin Netanyahu, and Donald Trump, as if that's the crucial element here. I think that Benny Gantz's campaign and the entire agenda of the Blue and White Party is so much countering Netanyahu at this point in time. And Netanyahu's agenda, for that matter, is so much of rooting for a self-sufficient right-wing government that there's simply no middle ground, at least not at the third round of election. I can't even believe I'm saying that, to create a unity government based on the peace plan. And more so, Netanyahu truly believed that this great unveiling and this so-called green light to pursue Israeli annexation over the West Bank will give him much credit among right-wing circles, what matured to be not that accurate. I think that the peace plan is not going to play that significant of a role, at least not as Netanyahu expected it to be, in the third elections here in Israel. The sad or honest truth, you can choose the phrasing. And by the way, Labor Gesher Meretz, the leftist union, input on a peace plan, didn't really hear about it. Have you?
No, they're no fans of the Trump peace plan, that's for sure. Listen, I don't have too much to add. I tend to disagree a little bit with Calev. I think for Trump this really was political. I think this was another way for him to connect to his evangelical base. Don't forget, without support from evangelicals, at least in 2016, Donald Trump is not president. He doesn't win the Republican nomination. At least in theory, that's still true. Again, it's not realistic at this point that he would lose the Republican nomination. But the point is he needs support and even enthusiasm from evangelicals. I think this was for him one of many ways to try to get there.
All right, now we started to talk about Donald Trump and the U.S. election, so I'm going to have to can't call this meeting to a close right now, or we're going to be here for another 3 hours.
I just wanted to say quickly, first, thank you to the three of you, and to wrap up, I wanted to just do a little crystal ball gazing, 20, 30 seconds each. What do you predict for this round of elections? What kind of a government do you think we'll see? Do you think we're seeing fourth round of elections?
Well, as the MC, I'm going to take the advantage and pass the microphone first, so I could first hear what she says, and Owen, and then I'll go last.
I think you're going to see my 10th version here in June, right? July? My math is right?
Just change. Here we go again. That works.
Hey, here we go again. 4. You put a Roman numerals, be like the Super Bowl. Listen, I'm not going to predict the overall results, but again, going back to this poll, a dark horse result no one's talking about, but if you read this poll carefully, a real possibility, Yisrael Beitenu does not make it back into the Knesset. According to this poll gives it 6 mandates. If you take a deep dive into the numbers, I have no idea how that's true. Among people who say that they're confident they're going to vote, they get below the mandate, the number, and even if you look at the total number of votes, 4%. One poll, how much faith can you put in one poll, even though it's ours? But if that's true, it would be an earthquake in Israeli politics. It would change the political map completely and be a major story. So, watch. We'll see.
The story of the April elections, by the way, Israel Beitenu did not make it across the electoral threshold, right?
Right, and then they did.
I believe there will be a unity government. Benjamin Netanyahu will step aside for his trial, and someone else in the Likud will emerge as a temporary caretaker of the government. I just want to... Yeah, I'm sorry. What are you pointing at? I don't know what you...
Who knows, my daughter?
What? I'm sorry. What? Yeah. Okay. I just want to thank you all for coming. I want to just leave you with one brief note. I hope that anything we said hasn't discouraged you from voting in the election, and we haven't given a clear answer, but I do want you all to keep in mind the famous words of Winston Churchill, who said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for every other form of government that has ever been tried." So hopefully you'll go out and vote, maybe a little bit informed, and maybe we'll see you again on the 4th round of elections.
And before you